white takes the center, as we have seen in our opening lesson, and black leaves the center to white. So here e5 was better. And that's already a mistake because the f pawn is the weakest of all pawns. Only starts square. The f pawn is only protected by the king, which makes it quite easy to attack. And we have already seen in a previous lesson attacks on the f7 and f2 pawns by the queen and the knight, or the queen and the bishop. So here this move is bad because it opens a diagonal on the king, it weakens the king's position, and it allows black to attack. Black challenges the center. Now white could have exchanged the pawns by taking the d5 pawn, but he chooses to push the pawn and control more space. So here white controls the f6 square, thus preventing the knight from developing. So in order for us to take the good habit of calculating, because we are still beginners, so I will show you the moves. Here, if white had taken the pawn, black could have retaken that pawn, and now you see the result. Black has a better control on the center than white. So that's a good move from black, controlling the center. It's already the third pawn move. You remember our lesson on how to play the chess opening. If not, check the playlist. So now both players should start thinking about developing their pieces. Okay, that's a correct square to develop the knight. Black also plays his knight correctly. So here the bishop could have been played to a more active square like b5. So if black had played here, the knight would have been pinned. Black cannot play his knight because it would open a diagonal and the king would be in check, and that's forbidden. So that's a way of putting pressure on enemy pieces. But white chose to develop his bishop to e2. Black cannot develop his knight to f6. The natural square is already closing the bishop's diagonal, so it will be difficult to develop the bishop. You already know that's a bad move, because this pawn takes the natural development square from the knight. That could maybe be justified temporarily if white wanted to play the d pawn to attack the center, and then this pawn would protect the d pawn. There is no push to d4. White again pushes the pawn one square forward, so the c3 previously played move did not justify itself. Playing inferior moves, white also gets a cramped position. Okay, developing the bishop, castling and castling. So the kings are in security. We will take the good habit of analyzing positions, which is much better than learning moves and traps. So here, what you see, let's look at the back rank. White still needs to develop two minor pieces, and black only one. So even though white plays first, black is better developed. White controls the diagonal, puts pressure on the pawns, and potentially can develop his bishop. The king and the queen are on the same diagonal, and that's a black diagonal. So here black wanted to make sure that this bishop at some point wouldn't come here to attack those two pieces. So that's a preventive move. Now have a look how this knight is blocked. He has no development square. We also know from our opening lessons that this knight is preventing the connection of the rooks. So both white rooks are less efficient because of the knight. If the knight was already developed and moved out of the back rank, then both rooks would protect each other and be much stronger. So by playing this move, white has created a weakness on the black camp. This pawn here, we call this a backward pawn. So why is that a weakness? Because no other pawn can protect this pawn. So in order to protect this pawn with a pawn, black should have had a pawn here or here. The problem is that these pawns are already advanced, And this backward pawn will be weak, and black will have to defend it with pieces. And of course, if you defend pawns with pieces, your pieces will be tied to the defense of pawns, and these pieces will be less efficient because you won't be able to use them to attack or even defend. Now, black also makes a weak move because he's abandoning the center. Come back to the previous move. Black has some control on the center. So now, look, white takes back. Look now at the position. Black has less influence in the center. Here black pushes. So again, we're going to analyze what happens if we take the black pawn. Then we create a weakness, which is a double pawn. And why is that a weakness? Again, because no other pawn can protect the c3 or the c4 pawn. So these pawns are weak and will be easily attacked by your opponent. So remember, we have seen one weakness, which is a backward pawn. We already seen a second form of weakness, which is a double pawn. So of course, after black's move, white is not going to take the black pawn because he doesn't want to have double pawns. So white pushes the pawn. And by doing so, white has created another weakness in black's position. We already seen this weakness, backward pawn. And there's also now this weakness. Because black won't be able to protect the c4 pawn with another one. So we'll have to protect it with pieces. And if you compare with white's pawns, white pawns are much better. White's weakest pawn will be this one. But this pawn is hidden behind the black pawn. So it's very difficult for black to attack it. Whereas this pawn is exposed. Later, black could play his rooks on the open file and attack the pawn. So black is probably trying to play b5, and so he's supporting this move with a knight. And you see how the weak undefended c pawn has disappeared. So black proposes an exchange of bishops. Again, if you are white, are we going to accept the exchange or not? Let's have a look. We take, he takes. What's the result? The result is that black has some control on the central squares. So black has some controls on central squares, and we got a weakness. Where is our weakness? This one. What type of weakness is it? Same as this one, which is a backward pawn. Again, here, if we had such a pawn, black would be able to attack it easily. Are we going to take black's bishop? Not, we are not. So white refuses the exchange of bishops. But white exchanges the bishop for the knight. Now black recaptures, and here white is better than before. So it was a good exchange for white. Why? Because this pawn became the passed pawn. What's a passed pawn? Let's have a look. We know that the pawns want to go forward, and these pawns want to queen, or to promote to another piece, but usually a queen. So, can this pawn advance safely? No, it cannot, because this pawn is preventing the moving forward. This pawn is preventing the white c3 pawn from advancing. However, you see how the d4 pawn can be stopped only by pieces. No black pawn can stop this d4 pawn, and that's what we call the passed pawn. And that's very strong. The more this pawn advances, the stronger it becomes, because it's threatening to promote to a much stronger piece. So here, at last, white develops his knight. It's not a great square, as we know. The knights on the edge are not very good. So we have another rule, trading for attack. You should try to eliminate your passive pieces for active ones. And here, black's bishop is very active. He's controlling two nice diagonals. So this bishop is better than the knight on a3. But by playing this move, white threatens the advance of his pawns. For example, attacking the bishop. So the bishop has to move out of the attack. And if the bishop retreats, then this pawn moves forward and attacks both the knight and the bishop. So white would win a minor piece for his pawn. And that's probably why black now eliminates the knight, eliminating the support for this pawn. Now the bishop had attacked this rook, and white is moving his rook on a useful square. So as we know, the rook like open files, and here we have a half open file, which means for white, no white pawn is blocking white from attacking, and here you see white puts a pressure on black's backward pawn. Here black is aiming for a d5 square, protecting this pawn and putting pressure on white's pawns. Also, black is blockading the passed pawn. When your opponent has a passed pawn, he wants to push it as much as possible, and you want to block as early as possible. The earlier you block a passed pawn, the less dangerous it will be, and the easier you will be able to eliminate it. This pawn was protected only by the bishop, so now white protects the pawn with the second pawn, and now the bishop is free to play somewhere else. You should try not to tie your pieces to the defense of lower value pieces. So defending a pawn with a piece is not very good. Defending a piece with a pawn is much better. The rook gets out of the attack. Black pins the knight. You see the white knight cannot move, otherwise it would be check. So immediately white unpins the knight so he can play his knight. So now the knight is free to play. Now black attacks the backward pawn twice with the queen and with the knight. So you see how black puts pressure on white's weakness. So white defends his weakness. Compare this knight to this bishop. So which piece is stronger? We see that the black bishop is centralized and controls a lot of squares, whereas the knight is on the edge and is not very efficient. So white should try to exchange his knight for that bishop, which he does. And now look at the position. White has eliminated the bishop, and he has created another weakness in black's position. Now this pawn is weak because it's isolated and it cannot be protected by other pawns. This pawn will fall fairly easily in the future. Now white proposed an exchange of queens, because white wants to go to the endgame. Why? Because he has this very strong pawn. So the less black pieces there are on the board, the easier it will be for this pawn to go forward and to promote. Black should have taken this pawn. By taking the a4 pawn, black would have created a passed pawn for himself. The a pawn wouldn't have any other pawn blocking him. So now we have a rule on the initiative. You should create threats to keep the initiative. And what is the initiative? It's when you have the move and you attack something and you force your opponent to reply. So you're dictating the pace of the game. And that's very important. White is attacking this knight, which is protected only by the queen and the queen. So if the queen retreated, for example here, to continue defending this pawn, then the knight would be lost. The queen would take the knight and black would be a piece down. So now black exchanges the queens. Now white can retake the queen with his rook or with his pawn. What's the better move? If we take the queen with the pawn, two things. First, black gets a passed pawn, which cannot be blocked by any white pawn anymore. And also, we have seen this weakness. The weakness is now covered. The white pawn is preventing the white pieces from attacking this pawn. So we see why taking with the pawn is bad. So after queen takes, white correctly took with the rook. Now after the exchange of queens, you see that white's advantage is bigger. Again, the rook is attacking two pieces and putting pressure on black's position. White should plan on increasing the pressure on the weakness, for example by playing his rook. We call this a doubled rooks. doubled rooks are very strong because now anything in front is attacked twice. So black protects the knight, white chases the knight. You see how the pawns are starting to move forward. The passed pawn is gaining in strength. That's a good move from white. That's a defending move because now white controls this square twice. So black cannot push his pawn. So now if black pushes his pawn, white could simply take it. That's why this king move is good. Also we'll see that later, but we have seen in the opening that the king should get out of the center by castling. You put your king in security, but in the endgame it's the opposite. In the endgame your king should be closer to the center because there are less attacking pieces, so the king becomes more important and the king becomes an attacking piece too. So many endgames are won because of a better king position. So white could have taken the b6 pawn with his rook, but he's not in a hurry. Now white attacks the b6 pawn twice, once with his bishop and once with his rook. As we said, now white should try to exchange as many pieces as possible so that passed pawn becomes even stronger. So white is trying to provoke black into exchanging his knight for the bishop. Now that's a bad move from black. If you look at the black rooks, they are on a black diagonal. And if you look at this bishop, it's a black squared bishop, which means if now this bishop takes this pawn, it would attack both rooks. So black would be able to save one of the rooks, but not the other. White did not see the bishop takes b6 move and attacked the knight. Now what would be a good move for black here? You already know that next white's move would be to take the b6 pawn. So normally black should take the bishop with his knight to eliminate that bishop. Black makes a mistake, does not eliminate the bishop, and puts his knight on a bad square. We already know that the knights don't like be on the edge of the board, so now this knight cannot participate to the defense. Of course the bishop takes the pawn, so we have another rule, another principle. If your opponent has a bishop, try to put your pieces on opposite colored squares from the bishop. Here, for example, these rooks would be better like this. Both rooks are on white squares and cannot be attacked by the bishop. That's a little trap. Suppose now that white takes the rook with his pawn. By doing so, he would open this file and the black rook could simply retake. So that would be an exchange of rooks. Of course, white doesn't take with his pawn, takes with the rook, and now black's second rook is also attacked by the bishop. It has to get out of the way, and now white is a piece up and should easily win the game. Now, passed pawns must be advanced as quickly as possible because their strength increases and your opponent will have to use his pieces to try to stop it, whereas your pieces will remain more active and will be used for attacking. As we said, in the end game, the kings should be closer to the center, and black is trying to bring his king to the center in order to defend, to stop the pawns from advancing. White doesn't lose time and advances his pawn. So another important principle, you should put your rooks behind your passed pawns. You see, this rook protects the pawn all the way to the c8 square. The king is approaching, but it's already too late. You see the pawn is already on the 7th rank, protected by both the bishop and the rook. Now the knight comes back to the center, but it's too late. With this move, white gives check and attacks the rook. So if the black king gets out of check, white can simply take the rook. That's why black has to take. And now the pawn takes the rook, promoting to a queen and delivering checkmate.